The ocean swallowed their voices, but the stones still speak. A speck of land, adrift in the endless Pacific, hid a civilization that should not have existed. A people who carved giants from volcanic rock and dragged them across a treeless wasteland, statues taller than kings staring inland with blank, unblinking fury. The Moai rise like sentinels of a forgotten pact, their faces eroded yet defiant, guarding an island where time itself fractured. Centuries before Europeans knew its name, Polynesian navigators, masters of the stars, crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to claim it, then vanished into silence. Forests fell. The earth cracked. Clan battled clan as the statues grew larger, heavier, more impossible, until the land could no longer bear their weight. By the time sails appeared on the horizon in 1722, Rapa Nui's glory was rubble, its builders reduced to whispers and bones. Slave raids followed, dragging its people away. Missionaries rewrote its faith in foreign ink. The statues remained, but their meaning turned to smoke. No records, only riddles carved in stone, staring back at us with a contempt that chills the blood. Something happened here, something colossal, something no one was meant to remember, yet the island refuses to forget. In the heart of the South Pacific, over 3,500 kilometers from Chile's coastline and more than 4,000 kilometers from Tahiti, lies Rapa Nui, an island so remote that for centuries it seemed severed from the rest of the human world. At just 163 square kilometers, it is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, a volcanic triangle thrust from the ocean floor roughly 3 million years ago. The land is not lush or forgiving. It is rugged, a landscape sculpted by eruptions long extinct, its hills marked by craters and lava tubes. 3 volcanic cones define its shape. Taravaka, the highest at 507 meters, rises in the north. Poik anchors the east. Reno Kau dominates the south. Between them, the island narrows into windswept plains, its soil rich in minerals but quickly exhausted under human hands. Its rocky cliffs plunge sharply into the endless Pacific, an expanse so vast and empty that early European navigators called it a marvel of human audacity that anyone had reached it at all. Yet people did reach it, navigating without maps, compasses, or modern tools. Archaeologists debate the exact date of their arrival, but radiocarbon evidence from charcoal and plant remains suggests Polynesian settlers may have landed between 800 and 1200 CE, perhaps closer to the later end of that range. These voyagers were part of one of humanity's greatest migration stories, the Polynesian expansion across the Pacific. Long before European explorers charted these waters, Polynesian navigators sailed double-hulled canoes across thousands of kilometers of open sea, guided by stars, ocean swells, and the flight paths of seabirds. Their mastery of maritime technology allowed them to colonize nearly every habitable island in this vast oceanic triangle, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south and Easter Island in the far east. Rapa Nui marked the extreme edge of this expansion, a speck of volcanic rock at the very limit of human reach, so far removed that for centuries after settlement, it remained effectively cut off from other islands. The settlers who arrived brought with them the core elements of Polynesian culture: stone tools, fire, domesticated plants such as taro, yams, and bananas, and animals like chickens. They also carried an advanced knowledge of agriculture, engineering, and social organization, skills that would prove essential in shaping a society that could survive in isolation. The island's environment, however, was unlike the tropical islands many Polynesians had previously settled. Rapa Nui had no large forests of coconut palms or breadfruit trees when Europeans first recorded it. Instead, it was dominated by a now-extinct species of giant palm, Paschalococos disperta, which once formed dense forests but disappeared over centuries of human use. Evidence from pollen records and ancient sediments reveals that when the first settlers landed, the island was heavily forested, home to a range of native birds and plants. Over time, as the population grew, trees were felled for firewood, agriculture, and the construction of canoes and tools, while introduced rats may have further hampered forest regeneration by eating palm seeds. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the towering palms were gone, and the island was treeless, its soil eroded by centuries of cultivation. Isolation shaped every aspect of Rapa Nui's culture. The island is roughly 24 kilometers long and 12 kilometers wide, with no safe natural harbor, only rocky coves where waves crash violently against the shore. Trade with neighboring islands, common across other parts of Polynesia, was impossible here. No other island lay within sight, and no records suggest regular voyaging after settlement. This meant every resource had to be carefully managed, and every innovation had to arise from within. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Rapa Nui people developed complex agricultural systems to compensate for the island's environmental constraints. They built manavai, stone-walled gardens that trapped moisture and protected crops from strong winds, and used lithic mulching, a technique where volcanic stones were spread over fields to slow evaporation, regulate soil temperature, and return nutrients to the earth. These innovations reveal a society highly attuned to the rhythms of a challenging environment, one that adapted with extraordinary ingenuity. The island's volcanic origin provided an abundance of stone, and this became the foundation of Rapa Nui's cultural identity. Basalt, obsidian, and volcanic tuff were quarried and shaped into tools, ceremonial structures, and the colossal statues that would later define the island's legacy. The Reno Raraku Quarry, at the southeastern slopes of Taravaka, became the heart of statue production. Even before the Moai rose across the landscape, stone was central to daily life. House foundations, agricultural terraces, and fishing tools all relied on volcanic materials. The lack of large mammals or freshwater rivers further emphasized the importance of human innovation. The settlers had to construct reservoirs, rely on small crater lakes, and manage their poultry as one of the few reliable sources of protein. This was a civilization built on precision, adaptation, and relentless problem-solving, all under the weight of total seclusion. The island's position in the Pacific was both a triumph and a prison. European explorers of the 18th century, armed with advanced navigation, were stunned by its remoteness. When Dutch commander Jacob Roggeveen sighted Rapa Nui on April 5, 1722, Easter Sunday, hence its European name, his log described an isolated land without trees, home to an astonishing number of stone statues. But centuries before Roggeveen's arrival, Rapa Nui's people had already built a thriving, hierarchical society. Without outside influence, their traditions evolved independently, resulting in cultural practices unique even within the broader Polynesian world. Their script, Rongorongo, remains undeciphered, and their religious system centered around ancestor veneration, materialized through the Moai, has no parallel in scale or ambition among other Pacific cultures. Geologically, Rapa Nui's formation left a legacy that influenced every facet of life. This triangular shape is the product of three separate volcanic events. Poik, the oldest, formed roughly 3 million years ago, followed by Reno Kau and finally Taravaka, whose lava flows eventually fused the three cones into a single island. The soil, derived from volcanic ash and rock, is rich but fragile, prone to erosion when stripped of vegetation. The surrounding waters, while teeming with fish, offer no coral reefs to soften waves or create safe lagoons. This meant that fishing required skill and risk, and farming became the backbone of survival. Archaeological digs reveal extensive stone chicken houses, hermoa, circular enclosures designed to protect birds from predation and theft, further proof of a society forced to innovate under environmental pressure. For centuries, this volcanic triangle was its own world, bounded by ocean horizons so vast they seemed infinite. The isolation fostered a culture that achieved extraordinary feats of engineering without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals. Stone adzes shaped Moai that weighed up to 82 tons, statues transported across uneven terrain by human hands. Oral traditions preserved clan histories, genealogies, and spiritual beliefs in the absence of written records accessible to outsiders. Every decision carried the weight of survival. There was no lifeline, no reinforcements, no neighboring island close enough to offer aid. The Pacific, for all its beauty, was a wall. Rapa Nui's people did not merely inhabit their land. They carved their entire existence into it, anchoring their society into a landscape that bore their ingenuity and, eventually, their decline. Long before the world learned its name, Rapa Nui stood alone, a small fragment of volcanic earth, the easternmost edge of Polynesia's vast cultural sphere, separated from every continent by thousands of kilometers of ocean. This extreme isolation did not stunt human ambition but sharpened it, driving the Rapa Nui people to create one of history's most enigmatic civilizations. Across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, long before Europe's first ships breached the Pacific, Polynesian navigators moved with purpose, precision, and mastery. They sailed without compasses, astrolabes, or metal instruments. They carried no maps in the sense the Western world understood them. Instead, their navigation was etched into memory, a living cartography passed through generations by oral tradition. They read the stars like written language, memorizing the rising and setting points of constellations, tracing them against the vastness of the horizon. They studied the paths of ocean swells, which rolled endlessly across the Pacific, each chain of islands bending them in subtle ways that only experience could interpret. The flight of seabirds revealed proximity to land. Cloud formations, different shades of ocean water, and even the scent of vegetation on the wind became guides. To Polynesians, the Pacific was not an empty void but a network of known signs, and they were among the greatest navigators in human history. Anthropological and archaeological studies trace this skill back centuries. The settlement of the Pacific was one of humanity's boldest migrations, extending over 10,000 kilometers of ocean and spanning thousands of years. Austronesian-speaking peoples began their movement eastward from Taiwan around 3000 BCE, settling the Philippines and reaching the islands of Melanesia by roughly 1500 BCE. From there, their descendants pushed further into the Central Pacific, forming what would become Polynesia. By around 1000 BCE, they had colonized Samoa and Tonga, and from this nucleus, the Polynesian cultural world emerged, one characterized by shared language roots, agricultural techniques, and seafaring innovations. They constructed double-hulled voyaging canoes, capable of carrying entire families, livestock, and plants over immense distances. These vessels were masterpieces of engineering, often over 20 meters long, lashed together with coconut fiber ropes and sealed with natural resins, stable enough to weather weeks at sea. The Polynesians carried with them a highly organized system of navigation called wayfinding, preserved by master navigators who trained for decades. Wayfinding combined astronomical knowledge with a sensory understanding of the ocean. Navigators memorized star lines, paths traced by specific stars rising and setting at precise points along the horizon. They recognized more than 200 stars and their movements, using them like a compass rose to orient themselves at night. During the day, they read the ocean swells, identifying subtle shifts caused by distant islands, even when no land was visible. Their understanding of bird migration added another layer. Certain species, such as terns and nadas, travel only within a set distance of land. The sight of a bird flying in a straight line at dusk or dawn could indicate where land lay beyond the horizon. This was not guesswork but a disciplined science encoded in oral tradition, chants, and mental charts. It was this expertise that brought Polynesians to Rapa Nui, one of the most remote islands on Earth. Archaeological findings suggest that they reached the island between 800 and 1200 CE, with recent studies leaning toward a later settlement date closer to 1200 CE. Their voyage to Rapa Nui represented the extreme eastern reach of the Polynesian world. Oral traditions preserved by Rapa Nui's descendants speak of Hotu Matue, a founding chief who led the first settlers, though historians treat this legend as symbolic rather than literal. The most widely supported theory places their departure point in the Marquesas or Society Islands, over 3,700 kilometers to the west. Reaching Rapa Nui from those islands required extraordinary precision. The target was a volcanic island barely 24 kilometers long, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of ocean. When the settlers arrived, they encountered an environment vastly different from the lush islands they had left. Pollen records from sediment cores show that Rapa Nui was once covered in a forest dominated by giant palms. But even at its most fertile, the island lacked the diversity of flora and fauna found elsewhere in Polynesia. There were no large land mammals and only a limited variety of seabirds. Freshwater sources were scarce, limited to crater lakes within volcanic calderas and a few underground springs. Yet, far from being primitive, the settlers demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They brought with them root crops like taro and yam, as well as bananas and sweet potatoes, the latter believed to have been introduced through contact with South America, indicating a network of interactions across vast distances. They raised chickens in carefully constructed stone enclosures, Moai, designed to protect them from both theft and predators. The settlers organized themselves into clans, each claiming sections of the island's coast. Archaeological surveys have identified hundreds of stone house foundations, laid out in elongated, boat-shaped patterns, reflecting the maritime origins of their builders. Their society was hierarchical, led by Ariki, chiefs, who derived their authority from ancestral lineage, while priests oversaw rituals tied to agriculture and cosmology. The social and political structure of Rapa Nui was typical of Polynesian societies, emphasizing kinship networks, oral genealogies, and ceremonial gatherings, but the island's isolation amplified these systems, making self-reliance critical. Agricultural innovation was central to survival. Archaeologists have identified thousands of manavai, stone-walled gardens that created microclimates for crops by conserving moisture and shielding plants from harsh winds. Another technique, lithic mulching, involved covering fields with volcanic rocks, which retained heat, reduced evaporation, and slowly released nutrients into the soil. These practices allowed the population to grow despite limited resources, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of environmental management. Evidence of intensive cultivation across the island shows that agriculture was not a mere subsistence activity but a carefully planned system capable of sustaining a complex society. The Polynesians' arrival at Rapa Nui was not an isolated feat. It was part of a larger cultural network that spanned the Pacific, connecting Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti, Samoa, and Tonga in a triangle of shared traditions. While Rapa Nui's remoteness eventually cut it off from frequent contact, its settlement illustrates that Polynesians were not accidental voyagers blown off course but deliberate explorers operating with precision. Modern experimental voyages, such as those undertaken by the Polynesian Voyaging Society using traditional canoes like kli, have confirmed the accuracy of ancient navigation techniques, showing that skilled navigators could travel thousands of kilometers and return safely. As centuries passed, Rapa Nui's people adapted fully to their environment, shaping a society unlike any other. Oral traditions preserved their history, encoded in chants and stories, while their religious beliefs revolved around ancestor worship, a core Polynesian practice that would later manifest in monumental stone statues. Yet even in these early centuries, their isolation meant that every innovation, every system of survival was internally developed. The island became a world unto itself, its society growing increasingly specialized. Archaeological evidence points to complex stonework not only in ceremonial platforms but also in everyday life. Stone chicken houses, fishing tools carved from basalt, and terraces built to conserve soil all testify to a population that responded to environmental limitations with ingenuity rather than regression. The Polynesians who settled Rapa Nui represented the culmination of thousands of years of maritime expansion. Their arrival was the endpoint of a migration that began with the Austronesian dispersal from Southeast Asia, crossed the Melanesian islands, and gave rise to a vast cultural sphere that mastered some of the most challenging seas on Earth. That this migration reached Rapa Nui, a volcanic island lost in an ocean expanse larger than all the continents combined, is one of history's most profound testaments to human skill and ambition. Their survival here, far from their ancestral homelands, would give rise to a civilization that left behind some of the most enigmatic monuments ever built. But in these first centuries, it was their navigation, their agricultural strategies, and their mastery of isolation that defined their achievement. The Moai stand as one of history's most striking achievements. Nearly 900 monumental statues, each carved with precision from volcanic stone, spread across Rapa Nui's windswept terrain. Their faces are elongated, their brows heavy, their expressions solemn yet commanding, staring inland as if guarding the island and its people. Some rise over 10 meters tall, their weight reaching up to 82 tons. They are not merely sculptures but sacred representations of ancestors elevated to divine status, embodiments of lineage and authority. To the Rapa Nui, These statues were not symbols alone. They were living presences, protectors of land and clan, charged with mana, spiritual power believed to emanate from the ancestors they depicted. Each Moai was a vessel of memory, a testament to power, a spiritual guardian anchoring its clan's identity. The process of carving these statues began at Reno Raraku, a volcanic crater that became the central quarry for nearly every Moai ever created. Archaeological surveys reveal that over 90% of the statues were sculpted from volcanic tuff, a compressed volcanic ash that, though softer than basalt, was still immensely challenging to work with stone tools. Reno Raraku remains a silent workshop frozen in time. Hundreds of unfinished Moai are still embedded in its slopes, some partially carved, others abandoned mid-transport. These relics provide a direct window into the craftsmanship and effort that defined Rapa Nui society. The tools used were painstakingly simple: basalt toki, handheld chisels sharpened from hard volcanic rock, which workers used to shape the massive statues with precision. The artistry was methodical. Carvers outlined the Moai's form while it was still attached to the bedrock, shaping the front, sides, and features before detaching it from the stone below. Once freed, the statue was maneuvered down the slopes, ready for transportation across uneven, treacherous terrain. The scale of this achievement becomes clearer when one considers the island's physical limitations. Rapa Nui lacked large trees after centuries of deforestation, which has long fueled speculation about how these monoliths were moved. Theories developed over the years, from rolling the statues on wooden logs to sliding them on sleds. However, experimental archaeology has provided compelling evidence for another technique: walking the statues. Researchers, working with local Rapa Nui knowledge, demonstrated that with coordinated teams pulling ropes tied to the head and base, the statues could be rocked side to side in a controlled motion, effectively walking them forward. This method aligns with oral traditions passed down by Rapa Nui elders, which recount that the Moai walked to their final positions. The engineering required not only physical strength but immense planning, coordination, and mastery of balance, as a single mistake could shatter years of work. The Moai were not placed arbitrarily. They stood upon massive stone platforms called ahu, carefully engineered ceremonial structures built from basalt and other volcanic stones. These platforms were feats of precision architecture, often constructed near the coast with the statues facing inland, symbolically overseeing their clan lands. Some ahu reached over 4 meters in height and extended more than 50 meters in length, composed of interlocking stones fitted together without mortar, demonstrating a level of craftsmanship comparable to other ancient megalithic sites worldwide. Archaeologists have documented at least 300 ahu across the island, each associated with specific lineages. The ahu were not merely pedestals but sacred spaces, often containing burial chambers or serving as the center of religious ceremonies. The act of erecting a Moai was therefore both a spiritual and political act, reinforcing the power of a clan's chief and the sanctity of their ancestors. The construction of Moai was a collective endeavor that unified entire communities. Oral traditions and archaeological evidence indicate a complex system of labor organization. Workers were divided into teams: stone carvers at Reno Raraku, engineers and rope handlers responsible for transportation, and specialists overseeing construction of the ahu. Each clan invested enormous resources in these projects, as competition between lineages drove the Moai to become larger and more elaborate over time. This escalation in scale, sometimes referred to as a monumental arms race, reflects the centrality of ancestor worship in Rapa Nui society. The statues were not mere decoration. They were expressions of prestige and power that validated political authority. The physical features of the Moai carry significant cultural meaning. Their elongated heads, prominent brows, and deep-set eyes reflect a stylized form of ancestral representation unique to Rapa Nui. The eyes, once inlaid with white coral and red scoria pupils, would have given the statues a lifelike presence, activating their spiritual energy once raised on an ahu. Archaeological reconstructions suggest that when a Moai was finally erected and its eyes installed, it symbolically saw the land it protected, channeling ancestral blessings to ensure agricultural prosperity and social harmony. The statues' sheer size and placement facing inland reinforced their role as spiritual overseers rather than objects of worship themselves. Red scoria topknots, known as pukeo, further emphasized status and reverence. Carved separately from a distinct quarry at Punapau, these cylindrical stone adornments, some weighing up to 12 tons, were positioned on the heads of many Moai, signifying high rank and divine authority. Transporting and balancing these massive pukeo atop statues already standing several meters high required extraordinary engineering skill. Archaeologists believe ramps were constructed alongside the statues, allowing workers to roll the pukeo into place using a combination of levers and stone ramps, further evidence of the Rapa Nui's mastery of stonework and construction. The entire process of Moai creation was deeply ceremonial. Oral histories describe rituals performed during carving, transportation, and erection, linking every phase to spiritual belief. These statues were not inert monuments but active participants in the community's life, tied to agricultural cycles, clan politics, and religious traditions. Their power was believed to emanate from mana, a sacred energy drawn from the ancestors they embodied. By raising a Moai, a clan affirmed its lineage's prestige, its right to territory, and its connection to the spiritual world. The scale of this cultural endeavor was monumental. Nearly every accessible quarry on the island shows evidence of stone extraction. Reino Raraku itself contains over 400 statues in various stages of completion, illustrating centuries of continuous carving. Some statues were never moved, frozen mid-creation, possibly due to shifts in social or environmental conditions. The largest statue ever attempted, known as El Gigante, remains unfinished, measuring over 21 meters in length and estimated to weigh 145 tons, a project that was likely abandoned due to logistical impossibility. The proliferation of statues across Rapa Nui transformed the island into a sacred landscape, each Moai a silent assertion of lineage and spiritual presence. From the towering statues at Ahu Tongariki, once toppled by internal conflicts but later restored, to the solitary figures overlooking distant cliffs, the Moai demonstrate a society's unwavering devotion to its ancestors. Archaeological evidence suggests that the construction of Moai peaked between 1400 and 1600 CE, a period of cultural flourishing driven by complex religious and political systems. Every Moai that stands today is a fragment of this era, bearing the marks of basalt chisels and the cultural weight of centuries. The Moai, their platforms, and the ceremonial spaces surrounding them form one of the most remarkable artistic and engineering achievements of the pre-modern world. They are not relics of an isolated people working in obscurity but evidence of a sophisticated culture that transformed a volcanic island into a sacred monument. Every statue remains rooted in the bedrock of ancestral tradition, each one a permanent witness to the society that carved power into stone. Rapa Nui's society was a complex system of power, lineage, and spiritual authority, anchored by the belief that ancestors guided the living and controlled the fortunes of the land. Every Moai was a statement of political strength, a towering proclamation of a clan's prestige, and the scale of each monument was inseparable from the competition that shaped the island's social order. At the heart of this structure stood the Ariki Mau, the paramount chief, a figure whose authority extended over the entire island. Beneath him, lesser Ariki and clan leaders controlled individual territories, each tracing their lineage back to revered ancestors. Power was not abstract. It was carved into volcanic stone, manifested in statues that dominated the island's sacred landscapes. The island was divided into numerous clan territories, each marked by its own ahu, the massive stone platforms where Moai were raised. Archaeological surveys show that there were at least 11 or 12 major clans, with subdivisions forming a dense network of kinship-based communities. Territorial boundaries were clear and respected, and these divisions determined where statues stood, where crops were grown, and which fishing spots were controlled. Lineage was paramount. Ancestry legitimized a clan's rights, and the ability to commission and erect larger Moai directly reflected the mana, the sacred spiritual power that a lineage claimed. As competition grew, Moai became not only spiritual objects but instruments of prestige warfare, each statue symbolizing a clan's dominance over the island's scarce resources. Leadership was sustained not only by hereditary succession but also by religious authority. The priestly class, the Tangata Rongo, preserved sacred knowledge, chants, and astronomical observations, ensuring that agricultural cycles aligned with rituals. Their role extended beyond spiritual guidance. They advised chiefs on decisions tied to farming, fishing, and monument building. Rapa Nui's religion, centered on ancestor worship, gave political leaders divine legitimacy. The Ariki was not merely a ruler but a living connection to powerful ancestors, and his authority was enforced through elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the sacred role of the Moai. Archaeological evidence of elaborate ceremonial complexes at sites like Ahu Tongariki and Ahu now highlights this intersection of political and spiritual power, where platforms, statues, and rituals formed a single system of governance. Sustaining this hierarchical structure required extraordinary environmental ingenuity. Rapa Nui's landscape, limited in freshwater sources and agricultural diversity, forced its inhabitants to create a highly engineered system of food production. Archaeological studies reveal thousands of manavai, circular stone-walled gardens that protected crops from salt-laden winds and preserved soil moisture. These gardens were critical for cultivating staples like sweet potatoes, taro, and yams. The use of volcanic rock in farming extended beyond the manavai. Lithic mulching, the practice of scattering stones over fields, became one of Rapa Nui's defining agricultural strategies. This technique improved soil fertility by capturing heat during the day and releasing it at night, reducing evaporation and accelerating nutrient cycling. Researchers estimate that by 1400 CE, much of the island's agricultural land was managed with stone-based systems, turning otherwise marginal soils into productive farmland. Protein sources were equally controlled and innovatively managed. Chickens, introduced by the first settlers, became a cornerstone of the island's diet, and their protection was paramount. Archaeological excavations have documented hundreds of hair moa, stone chicken houses, built to safeguard poultry from theft and predation. These low, circular structures with narrow entrances reflect a society where resource security was an essential part of political authority. Fish and shellfish provided supplemental protein, but Rapa Nui's remote waters lacked the abundance of reef species seen elsewhere in Polynesia, placing further emphasis on agricultural management and livestock control. The ability of a clan to maintain food stores directly influenced its capacity to command labor for Moai construction, reinforcing a cycle where political power, spiritual legitimacy, and agricultural expertise were inseparable. Moai construction itself was the ultimate display of this hierarchy. Carving a statue required not only skilled artisans but a mobilized workforce capable of sustaining months or years of labor. Each stage of creation, quarrying, transportation, and erection, demanded resources and coordination that only powerful clans could marshal. The Ariki oversaw these efforts, supported by priests and specialists who performed rituals to ensure the statue was infused with spiritual energy. Oral traditions recount elaborate ceremonies accompanying the raising of a moai, where the final placement of coral eyes activated the statue's mana, transforming it into a guardian presence. Through this process, political leadership was visually and spiritually reinforced. Larger moai meant greater prestige. Their towering forms were physical representations of lineage strength, visible symbols of control that overshadowed rival territories. Archaeological data shows a clear progression in statue size over time. Early moai, dating from around 1100 CE, were smaller and simpler in design, often standing less than 2 meters tall. By 1400 CE, the statues had grown significantly, with the tallest completed moai reaching nearly 10 meters in height. This escalation mirrored social dynamics, as clans competed to assert dominance. The proliferation of massive statues across the island is evidence of a centralized cultural value system where power was inseparable from monumental construction. Unlike other Polynesian societies, where chiefly power was demonstrated through warfare or large canoe fleets, Rapa Nui's isolation turned stone monuments into the ultimate display of wealth and status. The construction of ceremonial centers further illustrates this integration of power and spirituality. Each ahu was a masterpiece of engineering, often built with carefully fitted stones that required no mortar, rivaling the precision seen in Andean or Mediterranean stonework. Many platforms incorporated burial chambers, emphasizing the link between the living and their ancestors. Some sites, such as Ahu Vanapu, display architectural features strikingly similar to Inca masonry, leading to early speculation about contact with South America, though current scholarship attributes these similarities to independent innovation. The complexity of these structures reveals a society with specialized roles. Masons, carvers, religious leaders, and organizers, all operating within a rigid hierarchy centered around ancestral worship. Clans were more than political entities. They were cultural ecosystems, each preserving its own oral traditions, genealogies, and religious practices. Oral histories recorded in the 19th and 20th centuries speak of lineages tracing descent from the legendary first chief Hotu Matue, who is said to have arrived with his followers in double-hulled canoes centuries earlier. While scholars view this tradition symbolically rather than literally, it underscores the cultural emphasis placed on ancestry and descent. Leadership was not simply a matter of strength but of divine right, believed to be inherited through sacred bloodlines. The Ariki's authority extended beyond governance. He was a mediator between the spiritual and earthly realms, a role that justified the immense labor invested in monumental works. By the height of statue building in the 15th and 16th centuries, Rapa Nui had become a society entirely defined by its spiritual and political structures. The island's entire physical landscape was shaped by human effort. Fields reinforced with stone mulch, chicken houses dotting the terrain, quarries filled with half-carved statues, and ceremonial platforms lining the coast. Archaeological studies show that nearly every community invested in Moai production, but the resources required to sustain this cultural system were immense, setting the stage for future environmental strain. Yet at this stage, the Rapa Nui world was one of extraordinary order, with social, religious, and agricultural systems intricately interwoven. The Moai stood as both spiritual sentinels and political markers, each statue a declaration of ancestral dominance over territory. They were silent, immovable manifestations of power, tied to a societal structure that elevated the chiefs and priestly elite while binding communities together through ritual and shared heritage. The island itself became a living testament to lineage and authority, its geography transformed into a sacred landscape where every stone was placed with intent, every structure carried meaning, and every decision was tied to survival. The rise of Rapa Nui's monumental culture reached its breaking point long before European ships appeared on the horizon. For centuries, the island's society had revolved around Moai construction, a tradition that consumed vast amounts of labor, timber, and stone, reshaping every aspect of life. By the late 15th century, the demand for resources to sustain this monumental system collided with the island's environmental limits. Archaeological studies show that the once forested island, dominated by giant jubia palms, underwent complete deforestation by the year 1600. Pollen analysis reveals a gradual decline in tree cover starting as early as 1200 CE, with charcoal deposits suggesting widespread slash-and-burn agriculture and woodcutting. The palm trees, some of which grew over 15 meters tall, were critical for canoe construction, housing materials, and most importantly, as rollers or sledges for transporting Moai. Their disappearance marked a decisive shift in the island's economy and its cultural trajectory. The absence of large timber restricted open ocean fishing, reducing the availability of deep-sea species like tuna and mahi-mahi that once supplemented the diet. With fishing technology diminished, the population relied heavily on agriculture, which was already under pressure. The island's soils, formed on volcanic rock and naturally nutrient-poor, became vulnerable to erosion as vegetation cover vanished. Without trees to anchor the earth, wind and rainfall stripped away topsoil, creating barren patches across Rapa Nui's interior. Archaeological surveys indicate widespread use of lithic mulching and rock gardens during this period, clear evidence of human adaptation to deteriorating conditions. These innovations allowed agriculture to persist, but they could not restore the full fertility of the land. Yields of staples like sweet potatoes, taro, and bananas declined, creating stress for a society that had once sustained a flourishing monument-building culture. The effects of deforestation extended beyond food production. Canoe-making became nearly impossible, isolating the population and limiting maritime resources. The loss of wood impacted housing and fuel supplies, forcing people to rely on smaller shrubs and grasses. These environmental pressures exacerbated social tensions as competing clans faced resource scarcity. Oral traditions collected in the 19th century recount a time of internal warfare, when rival lineages, once united in ancestor veneration, turned against one another. This era, known as the Moai, the statue toppling, saw the systematic destruction of the very monuments that had defined Rapa Nui's spiritual and political life. Archaeological evidence supports this tradition. Almost every Moai on the island was found toppled, many with their necks deliberately broken. This was not random vandalism but a symbolic act of dismantling the authority of rival clans, an assault on the mana embodied in the statues. The collapse of the Moai cult marked a profound transformation in Rapa Nui's religious system. By the late 17th century, the Birdman cult had emerged as the dominant spiritual order, centered not on ancestral statues but on an annual competition at Orongo, a ceremonial village perched on the cliffs of Reno Cow Crater. Each year, representatives of powerful clans competed to obtain the first egg of the sooty tern, a seabird nesting on the nearby islet of Motu Nui. The victor's clan leader, or his chosen champion, would scale the cliffs, swim through treacherous waters, and return with the egg intact. The winner was declared Tangata Manu, the Birdman, an embodiment of divine favor who ruled for a year. This new system of leadership replaced hereditary chiefdoms with ritualized competition, reflecting the fractured and militarized state of Rapa Nui society. Petroglyphs at Orongo, depicting Birdman figures and sooty terns, are remnants of this ideological shift, illustrating a dramatic departure from the island's centuries-old tradition of ancestor worship. The timing of this religious and political transformation has fueled intense scholarly debate. Some historians argue that Rapa Nui's societal collapse was primarily self-inflicted, a result of ecological overreach, deforestation, and resource depletion. This interpretation, popularized in the early 2000s, presents Rapa Nui as a cautionary tale of environmental destruction, a closed system where human ambition overwhelmed natural limits. Yet recent research challenges this narrative. Archaeological studies have shown that while deforestation was severe, the islanders demonstrated remarkable resilience, developing sustainable agricultural systems and adapting to changing conditions. The narrative of ecocide oversimplifies a more complex reality, one that cannot be separated from external forces that struck the island in the 18th and 19th centuries. European contact, first recorded in 1722 when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday, introduced a new wave of devastation. Roggeveen's crew described a treeless landscape and toppled statues, suggesting that the statue cult had already collapsed by this point. However, European arrival brought smallpox, tuberculosis, and other foreign diseases that devastated the population. Subsequent visits by Spanish, British, and French ships in the late 18th century further destabilized the island. By the early 19th century, the population, once estimated at several thousand, had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. The most catastrophic external blow came in 1862, when Peruvian slave raids targeted Rapa Nui. Slave traders, seeking labor for guano extraction on the Chincha Islands, abducted over 1,400 Rapa Nui men, women, and children, nearly half of the island's remaining population. The captives were taken to Peru under brutal conditions, and only a handful ever returned. Among those lost were many of the island's religious and cultural leaders, whose deaths further severed the continuity of oral traditions and spiritual practices. Survivors brought back new diseases, triggering further demographic collapse. By 1877, when Catholic missionaries established permanent settlements on the island, the population had dwindled to just 111 individuals. This near-extinction event was not the product of internal ecological failure alone, but a convergence of environmental strain, European contact, and forced labor raids that obliterated Rapa Nui's social structure. Archaeological interpretation of the statue toppling period reflects this complexity. Radiocarbon dating of toppled statues suggests that the Moai phase occurred over several centuries, rather than as a single catastrophic event. Some statues were deliberately destroyed as early as the 1600s, while others were toppled closer to the 18th century. This extended period of iconoclasm aligns with the oral traditions describing clan warfare, suggesting a gradual societal transformation rather than an overnight collapse. Furthermore, pollen records and sediment analysis indicate that Rapa Nui's deforestation was not solely the result of human exploitation. Introduced species such as the Polynesian rat likely played a role in preventing palm regeneration, compounding human impact. The Birdman cult itself reflects an adaptive response to environmental limitations. With large-scale monument construction no longer feasible, spiritual authority shifted to a system that required fewer material resources but intensified competition. The Birdman ceremonies centralized power in a single ritualized contest, replacing hereditary privilege with merit-based religious prestige. This system persisted until European colonization disrupted the island's cultural practices, yet its legacy endures in the carvings and ceremonial architecture that remain at Orongo. Rapa Nui's fall, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simple morality tale of environmental collapse. It was a convergence of ecological strain, internal political upheaval, and devastating external forces that fractured an ancient society. The towering Moai, once symbols of unbroken lineage and spiritual power, were systematically dismantled during a period of internal strife, while the Birdman cult rose from the ashes of that destruction as a symbol of resilience. European disease and Peruvian slaving raids completed the disintegration, leaving the survivors to rebuild their culture in the shadow of overwhelming loss. The evidence buried in soil layers, carved into stone platforms, and preserved in oral traditions paints a picture of a society that endured centuries of adaptation, conflict, and catastrophe, its trajectory permanently altered by forces both within and beyond its shores. On April 5, 1722, Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen anchored off an island so remote it seemed to hover on the edge of the known world. His expedition, sailing under the Dutch West India Company, was seeking Terra Australis Incognita, but what they encountered was a speck of volcanic land rising from the Pacific, fringed by cliffs and crowned with colossal statues. It was Easter Sunday, and the crew named it Passion Island, Easter Island. The sight of towering Moai, some rising over 10 meters, stunned the Europeans. These stone figures, with their elongated faces and silent gaze, stood on massive Ahu platforms, guardians of a society no European had imagined. Roggeveen recorded his astonishment at their size and craftsmanship, yet his expedition lingered only briefly. In his journals, he described a treeless island, a small, seemingly impoverished population, and an architecture that defied its isolation. The Dutch fired muskets at approaching Rapa Nui men during a tense encounter, killing several. The first meeting between Rapa Nui and Europe was marked not by exchange, but by violence and incomprehension. 50 years later, in 1770, Spanish ships under Captain Felipe González de Ejido arrived, claiming the island for the Spanish crown. They raised a cross and left a plaque, asserting dominion over a land they barely understood. Spanish officers recorded the same stone monuments, already weathered and enigmatic, and remarked on the absence of trees large enough for shipbuilding. They signed treaties with local chiefs, collecting their signatures in Rongorongo script, evidence of a written language unique to Rapa Nui, though one now largely lost. This fleeting claim of empire faded quickly, but the visit marked another intrusion of foreign power into an island that had known only its own traditions for centuries. In 1774, British explorer James Cook anchored off Rapa Nui, accompanied by naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster. Cook's logs confirmed Roggeveen's earlier impression. The island was barren of tall trees, the soil eroded, and the population appeared small, living in simple stone houses and caves. Cook noted the statues, many already toppled, suggesting that internal conflicts had shaken the culture long before European arrival. Forster observed the use of stone mulching in agriculture and concluded that the islanders were skilled farmers despite their environmental constraints. Cook's expedition left without incident, yet their records reinforced the European perception of Rapa Nui as a society in decline. The next major encounter came with French explorer Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, in 1786. His expedition documented more details of the statues and ceremonial platforms, offering sketches that remain invaluable to modern historians. The French sailors described a people cautious but willing to approach, trading chickens and sweet potatoes for European goods. The interactions were brief but recorded in meticulous detail, providing a rare snapshot of Rapa Nui before the waves of 19th-century disruption. Each expedition added another layer of foreign observation, yet none grasped the island's complex social system, its history of ancestor worship, or the significance of the monumental statues that had become the island's defining feature. By the early 19th century, European and American ships regularly passed through the Pacific, and Rapa Nui became increasingly exposed to external influences. In 1805, an American ship is recorded as having kidnapped several islanders, foreshadowing the devastation to come. Diseases such as smallpox, tuberculosis, and syphilis began to infiltrate the population, introduced by passing sailors and traders. These infections, against which the isolated Rapa Nui had no immunity, quietly eroded their numbers. By mid-century, European contact had already destabilized the island's fragile society, but the most catastrophic blow was still ahead. In December 1862, Peruvian slave raids descended on Rapa Nui, altering its history irreversibly. Peruvian traders, driven by the demand for labor in the guano mines of the Chincha Islands, captured approximately 1,400 men, women, and children, nearly half the island's population. The raiders targeted individuals of status, including the king, priests, and those who preserved knowledge of the Rongorongo script. Forced aboard ships, many perished during the voyage. Those who survived endured brutal labor conditions in Peru. When international pressure forced Peru to repatriate survivors in 1863, only a handful returned, carrying new diseases that swept through the island, killing many of those who had not been captured. This event annihilated the island's cultural leadership and disrupted its oral traditions. The knowledge of Rongorongo, once a living script, was reduced to undecipherable fragments. By the 1870s, repeated waves of disease, slave raids, and forced labor campaigns had reduced Rapa Nui's population to unprecedented lows. Estimates suggest that only around 111 Rapa Nui people remained alive by 1877. Entire family lines were erased, and the island's cultural memory was shattered. The survivors, now living under constant threat of foreign exploitation, saw their ancestral lands leased to foreign settlers. The island became a center of sheep ranching under European control, with the indigenous population confined to a small settlement near Hangaroa, their movements restricted and their lands fenced off. Christian missionaries, primarily from the French Catholic Church, arrived in the 1860s and began the process of religious conversion. Father Eugene Arod, who first came to Rapa Nui in 1864, reported seeing Rongorongo tablets but lamented that few could still read them. Missionaries introduced Western education and Christianity, often erasing traditional practices in the process. The Birdman cult and other indigenous rituals were suppressed, and ancient sites were abandoned or repurposed. The missionaries provided some stability in a time of devastation, but their presence also accelerated the cultural transformation already underway, replacing a system of ancestor worship and oral history with European religious frameworks. The geopolitical context of this devastation cannot be separated from the expansion of imperial powers across the Pacific. Rapa Nui's remote position had shielded it for centuries, yet by the late 19th century, global shipping routes, resource extraction industries, and colonial ambitions made isolation impossible. The slave raids were not an isolated crime but part of a larger pattern of forced labor practices in the Pacific. The guano trade, driven by Western agricultural demand, consumed indigenous lives across Polynesia and South America. European explorers who had once regarded Rapa Nui as a curiosity now viewed it as a strategic resource. In 1888, Chile formally annexed Rapa Nui, signing a treaty with the remaining Rapa Nui leadership. While the Chilean government claimed sovereignty, administration of the island was outsourced to commercial interests, further marginalizing the indigenous population. The survivors of the 19th century's catastrophes became subjects in their own homeland, living under foreign administration while their monumental statues, symbols of their ancestors and history, were left weathering under foreign eyes. The impact of first contact and subsequent exploitation was devastating not because of a single event, but because of the relentless sequence of incursions that followed. From Ragavin's first sighting in 1722 to Chile's annexation in 1888, every encounter brought irreversible change. Disease, abduction, religious suppression, and cultural disintegration. The island's isolation, once a shield, became a trap, and its people, already struggling with internal challenges, were forced into a world of imperial extraction. The statues, standing silent, bore witness as an entire civilization was compressed into near extinction, leaving behind fragments of language, ritual, and knowledge that colonial archives would misinterpret for generations. In 1914, a British woman named Catherine Routledge set foot on Rapa Nui, an island already scarred by centuries of disease, slavery, and cultural suppression, yet still crowned with the towering Moai that had outlived the people who raised them. She arrived with her husband, William Scoresby Routledge, aboard their schooner Manna, bringing not just curiosity but the precision of an ethnographer. Her expedition marked the first systematic archaeological survey of Rapa Nui, and she began recording oral histories from the few remaining elders who still carried fragments of ancestral memory. Routledge mapped Ahu platforms, documented the placement of statues, and studied the enigmatic Rongorongo tablets that even by then had become largely undecipherable. She lived among the Rapa Nui people for over a year, interviewing those who had grown up before Chilean annexation in 1888, capturing details of traditions already fading. Her work, meticulous and pioneering, preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been erased by time and colonization. In 1919, she published The Mystery of Easter Island, a text that would shape the Western understanding of Rapa Nui for decades, though her interpretation, like all those of her time, was colored by the biases of an era that often underestimated Polynesian ingenuity. The early 20th century brought anthropologists, missionaries, and archaeologists, but Rapa Nui itself remained a closed and controlled environment. The Chilean state leased the entire island to the Williamson Balfour Company in 1903, turning it into a massive sheep ranch operated by the Easter Island Exploitation Company. The Rapa Nui people were confined to a single settlement near Hangaroa, prohibited from moving freely on their ancestral lands. Under this system of exploitation, the Moai stood weathering in silence while their creators' descendants were rendered laborers on the land they once ruled. Scholars came and went, photographing statues, sketching petroglyphs, and documenting ruins, but the Rapa Nui themselves were denied authority over their own heritage. Yet within this period of suppression, the island's knowledge bearers, few in number, their traditions carried through whispers rather than institutions, held fast to fragments of a history that foreign visitors could only partially reconstruct. The mid-20th century brought new global attention to Rapa Nui through a man whose theories would ignite controversy: Thor Heyerdahl. In 1947, Heyerdahl had achieved international fame with the Kon-Tiki expedition, sailing a raft from South America to Polynesia to argue that the islands of the Pacific had been settled by South Americans rather than Polynesians. In 1955, he launched an archaeological expedition to Rapa Nui, bringing international scientists, photographers, and workers to excavate statues and conduct experiments on their movement. Heyerdahl's team successfully raised a Moai using Stone Age tools and ropes, demonstrating that the statues could be erected without modern equipment. His dramatic publications and films captured global attention, framing Rapa Nui as a mystery of lost civilizations. Yet his central hypothesis that Rapa Nui had been settled from South America would later be discredited by linguistic, genetic, and archaeological evidence. Polynesian navigators, with their advanced wayfinding and double-hulled canoes, had reached the island around 1200 CE, long before European contact, and had built the Moai culture through their own ingenuity. Heyerdahl's expedition nonetheless played a vital role in bringing Rapa Nui into international consciousness, turning its statues into icons recognized worldwide. While foreign researchers debated origins, the Rapa Nui people lived under military administration, still excluded from control of their own lands. Chile had annexed Rapa Nui in 1888, but the island was administered harshly and its people were treated as second-class citizens. It wasn't until 1966, with the passage of the Ley Pascua, that the Rapa Nui gained Chilean citizenship and greater autonomy. This legal recognition marked a turning point, but by then decades of cultural suppression had taken their toll. Much of the oral tradition had been lost, rongorongo remained undeciphered, and the rituals that had once given life to the statues were fragmented memories. The Birdman competition, once central to the island's social order, had been banned by missionaries. Yet even as traditions were fractured, they were never extinguished. Modern archaeology has filled gaps that early explorers could not. Excavations have revealed that the Moai were not just heads but full-bodied figures, many buried up to their shoulders in soil due to centuries of erosion. Each statue was carved from volcanic tuff at Reno Raraku Quarry, where hundreds remain in various stages of completion, evidence of a sophisticated production process. The statues were then transported across the island, sometimes several kilometers, to be erected on ahu platforms facing inland to watch over communities. For decades, scholars debated how these colossal statues, some weighing over 80 tons, were moved. Early theories proposed wooden rollers, sledges, or ramps, but modern experiments have shown that teams using ropes could walk the statues forward with a swaying motion. An interpretation supported by oral traditions that spoke of the statues walking to their destinations. This evidence highlights the advanced engineering and organization of the Rapa Nui people, challenging outdated narratives that framed them as primitive or doomed by their own actions. Archaeologists such as Sergio Rapuhawa, himself Rapa Nui, have been central to reframing the island's history. His excavations have not only uncovered buried parts of the statues, but have also emphasized that the Moai culture was a product of Polynesian navigation and innovation, not external civilizations. Modern DNA studies confirm this, showing strong Polynesian ancestry with minimal South American influence prior to European contact. The narrative of Rapa Nui as a symbol of environmental self-destruction, popularized in works like Jared Diamond's Collapse, has also been challenged. Recent studies suggest that while deforestation and soil erosion occurred, Rapa Nui's society showed remarkable resilience, sustaining agriculture through innovations like lithic mulching, which used volcanic rocks to enrich the soil. The catastrophic collapse, often attributed solely to environmental overuse, was in fact accelerated by European-introduced disease, slavery, and colonization. In 1995, UNESCO declared Rapa Nui National Park a World Heritage Site, recognizing the global significance of the island's archaeological treasures. The park, covering over 40% of the island, contains hundreds of Moai, ahu, and petroglyphs, preserving them under international protection. Yet this recognition also sparked conversations about ownership and control, as the Rapa Nui people began pushing for greater stewardship of their heritage. In 2018, administration of the park was officially transferred to the Rapa Nui community, marking a historic moment in the island's ongoing cultural revival. This transfer was not merely bureaucratic. It symbolized a reclamation of history by those whose ancestors had built the monuments that had captivated the world. The revival of Rapa Nui culture continues to expand, with language revitalization programs teaching Rapa Nui, a Polynesian language that had been suppressed under Chilean rule. Traditional music, dance, and carving techniques have been resurrected, not as museum pieces but as living traditions. Annual festivals such as Tupti Rapa Nui celebrate these cultural practices while reinforcing ancestral identity. Scholars work alongside local experts, recognizing that archaeology alone cannot reconstruct the full story of Rapa Nui without the voices of its people. The Moai themselves, once viewed as relics of a vanished society, now stand as symbols of resilience. They are not ruins of a fallen civilization but monuments to a culture that endured slavery, epidemics, and colonization, and yet remains alive. Their silent faces, carved between 1250 and 1500 CE, carry layers of history that no single interpretation can exhaust. Questions remain about their exact methods of transportation, their symbolic meanings, and the full extent of Rapa Nui's pre-contact networks. Yet each excavation, each recovered artifact, and each Rapa Nui voice that reclaims ancestral knowledge adds a new dimension to this narrative. A reminder that the island's history is not a puzzle to be solved and filed away but a living chronicle, still unfolding.